Hello friends, welcome to the channel. This is Content for the Faith with Pastor James. I got a good one for you today. This is coming from PragerU. We're going to listen to this video, somewhat react to it, but also listen to the content as a whole, share my thought and perspective at the end. A lot of what was said in this video is good. And the title of this one is Remember the Sabbath. Now, he did an entire 10 Commandments breakdown, and I think the entire thing was good for the most part. There's likely one thing or two here that I disagree with, but a lot of what's said here was good. You know, in this channel, I've had so many people either contending, agreeing. Some people just don't know what to do, neutral, whatever it is. When it comes to the subject of the Sabbath, a lot of time people just either want to ignore it and wish it wasn't being talked about. Sometimes they just blame me for talking about Sabbath only, which is not true. I speak about a lot of different things. Actually, over 90% of my sermons have nothing to do with the Sabbath. Nevertheless, it's one of those touchy subjects, and I think it's a lot of misunderstanding. There's a lot of the perspective that a lot of people approach the Sabbath with. I think the perspective is wrong, and there's also the premise that I will say is completely flawed. However, I think with understanding and deeper education, with approaching this matter with an open heart, I think a lot more could be done. So again, I am not so much trying to please those who do not want to understand what is truth, but I'm looking for those who are hungry and thirsting to know the truth and willing to obey. So therefore, I'm focusing on this group of people rather than those who refuse to listen. But I think Dannis Prager on this one did an excellent job for the most part. You will see what I mean. Let's take a listen to the entire video, and at the end, I'll share my thought and perspective. Let's get to it. All right, Remember the Sabbath Day by Dannis Prager, PragerU.
Many people who revere the Ten Commandments don't think that the fourth is particularly important, let alone binding. Once you understand it, however, you will recognize how life-changing, even world-changing, the Sabbath commandment is, and you will begin to appreciate how relevant it is to your own life. The fourth commandment reads, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns." Why is this so important? First, perhaps more than any other commandment, it elevated the human being. How so? For nearly all of human history, life consisted overwhelmingly of work. In effect, humans were beasts of burden. This commandment, and only this commandment, changed all that by insisting that people cease working 1 day out of 7. Second, more than any other commandment, the Sabbath day reminds people that they are meant to be free. As the second version of the commandment, the one summarized by Moses in the book of Deuteronomy, states, "Remember that you were slaves in Egypt." In other words, remember that slaves cannot have a Sabbath. In light of this, I might add that in the biblical view, unless necessary for survival, people who choose to work 7 days a week are essentially slaves. Slaves to work, or perhaps to money, but slaves nonetheless. The millionaire who works 7 days a week is simply a rich slave. Third, while the Bible could not universally abolish slavery, the Sabbath commandment greatly humanized that terrible institution and even helped make slavery impossible. By definition, a slave owner was under no obligation to allow a slave to ever rest, let alone to rest 1 day every week. Yet that is exactly what the fourth commandment commanded. Even a slave has fundamental human rights. Therefore, a slave, too, is a human being. Fourth, the Sabbath almost single-handedly creates and strengthens family ties and friendships. When a person takes off from work 1 day every week, that day almost inevitably becomes a day spent with other people, namely family and or friends. It has similar positive effects on marriages. Ask anyone married to a workaholic how good it would be for their marriage if the workaholic would not work for one day each week. And you can appreciate the power of the Sabbath day. Fifth, the Sabbath commandment granted animals dignity. Even one's animals had to rest one day a week. It is, to the best of our knowledge, the first national law in history on behalf of animals. And its benefits to animals surely went beyond a mandatory day of rest for them. People who felt divinely obligated to give their animals a day of rest were much less likely to treat their animals cruelly any day of the week. Now, all 5 of these life-changing and society-changing benefits of the Sabbath are available to anyone. You don't have to be a Jew, a Christian, or even a believer in God to derive all these benefits. But the reality is that those who believe the 10 Commandments were given by God are the ones who have kept the Sabbath alive. The God factor plays another role in the Sabbath. Just as faith in God brings people to the Sabbath, observing the Sabbath brings people to faith in God. That is why the first version of the 10 Commandments, the version in the book of Exodus, ends with these words. For in 6 days God made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but he rested on the 7th day. Therefore God blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. However you interpret 6 days, and many Jewish and Christian believers do not translate days as 24-hour periods, the point is this. Every time you keep the Sabbath, you are affirming that there is a creator, that the world didn't just happen, that life isn't some meaningless coincidence, but that it is infinitely meaningful, and therefore each of us has a unique significance and purpose. Not bad for one day a week. No wonder that the Sabbath is one of the 10 Commandments. No wonder that those who have it in their lives are often happier, with richer family lives, more serenity, a community of friends, and yes, are even healthier. You might want to give it a try. I'm Dannis Prager. Join Prager.
Powerful. I mean, definitely, I think this was a great video. Dannis Prager is really, really good. I've actually listened to many of his videos from PragerU. Talks about a number of things as a conservative and also addresses a number of things that's going on in the world. Very educational as well. So great presentation. I think, yeah, this is like deodorant. So it's not what you guys might be thinking. Oh my goodness. I even have some on my chest. I put some body spray on, and I think that body spray. Anyway, enough about me. Let's get back to the video. Great video. I think the benefits he speaks about are actually true in regard to the slaves and also the animals and the resting and the family benefits is all true. And actually, you can benefit from the Sabbath, even though you may not be a Christian, although I'm going to put a little dot in that and I'm going to come back to explain. I think for the most part, the video was great. Over 90% of what he says is actually correct. The part that I have an issue with is the Sabbath day was not identified in the video, because what that does is, and again, this is only a 5 minutes video, and I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just simply saying is there is a gap here that must be addressed. The problem with this is people can easily say, my Sabbath is this, my Sabbath is that. And I want to make sure you understand, like, the significance of the Sabbath not only is rooted in the fact that God instituted it, but also God have actually picked the day itself. And the third thing I want to add is the fact God invested his presence in the day. Like, if you get that, everything else, all the arguments you might hear against the Sabbath just falls apart. So the question is, which day of the week God instituted as a Sabbath day? Don't guess. He tells you. So the scripture tells you in Genesis 2 at the end of the creation week, which is on the 6th day. And on the 7th, God didn't create anything. He ended the work. So he stopped working himself and he rested. So he's investing himself in it now. So the first Sabbath that was kept by God. I will go as far to say Adam and Eve didn't keep the Sabbath the first week that they were created. I should say Adam, because I don't know how long it was from Adam and Eve. I don't know how long God took to create Eve for Adam. So let me just say Adam. So God rested, God blessed the day, and God set the day apart. And I've said this in my last video. The reason why the Sabbath is significant in itself is because the presence of God is in it. What makes the day holy is God himself. Wherever God goes, whether it is a time, a place, a burning bush, the sanctuary, in the hearts of men, or in among the priests, or inside of the church, the thing becomes sacred, holy, set apart for a holy purpose because the presence of God is in it. So you cannot do this with any other day of the week. It is only on the 7th. That's why a person choosing Monday as the Sabbath, yeah, it's good. You just took a day off. You have a vacation day. That's fine. It's PTO. Good for you. But that's not the Sabbath, right? You can have holidays and everything, right? These are not Sabbaths. They are just a day, a day off to celebrate a particular event, whatever that is, right? The difference with the biblical Sabbath is that the day was already set apart at the end of the creation week by God because it commemorates creation. It is a sign that God is the creator of the world. So you cannot make a new sign. It's like in the Sabbath, God signs his name over his creative work. The Sabbath is that significant for God. It's almost like without the 7-day Sabbath, creation would not have an owner. I hope you understand. Like, in other words, if God simply created everything and did not have a Sabbath, right? Anybody could have claimed that creation belongs to who? Joe Blow, Joe this, who know, Penzi or Petro. Any man could have come and say, I created the world. The reason we know God is the creator is because of the Sabbath. Because the Sabbath sets the weekly cycle. The Sabbath commemorates creation. The Sabbath instituted after God created the rest of the week. And God himself invested himself in the Sabbath, which set it apart from all others. And again, people will say, I know the argument will come, I can still pick whatever day I want. You cannot. It doesn't work like that. That's not Sabbath keeping. You cannot pick your own birthday. You cannot pick your own anniversary. You cannot make any day of the week Independence Day. No. These things are in place because of the event that happened on that specific day. The Sabbath cannot be picked or chosen or substituted by another day because it commemorates creation. It represents what God had done, and God only invested himself in one day. You can't do that. To do that, I've said it before, it's an act of blasphemy. To actually say I can pick my own Sabbath is like you saying to God, I don't care what you did. I'm making my own. Now, you can take a day off, but it's not keeping Sabbath holy. Now, there's another thing that he said. So connecting to the significance of the day itself, that's one thing. Understanding the presence of God in a day, that's another thing. He mentioned how the day could also be kept by just anybody, even an unbeliever. Well, it can. You can benefit from the day. But what significance is Sabbath keeping to a person who does not believe in the God who created him? I don't get that. In other words, you can benefit of the same blessings on any other day of the week. So you can say, okay, I'm keeping Monday as my Sabbath. I don't believe in God, so it doesn't necessarily matter. Well, I'm keeping my animals. I'm not working. I'm not doing these things. Okay, that's fine. Yeah, you're keeping a day. You resting on a day, but you're not keeping the Sabbath day. So to keep the Sabbath without a belief in God is a waste of time. It's a waste of time because, yes, you will benefit physically speaking from an earthly perspective, but the spiritual side of the Sabbath is just as significant because God wants to invest in you the same way he had invested himself in the Sabbath. That's why when you keep the Sabbath holy, what you end up doing is that you are trusting that God can make you holy. You are trusting that God is your creator and is also the one who can recreate in you a clean heart and renew a right spirit. It's actually an act of faith in God's righteousness. When you keep the Sabbath, you are saying, I believe only God can save me. That's what you're saying. So if you don't believe in God and you're keeping Sabbath, well, you're kind of wasting your time. Now, some people believe in God and do not keep the Sabbath. Well, that's still wrong. And again, I love what he said here. The Sabbath is in the Ten Commandments. Again, guys, you got to get this. It's not one of the Moses law. That's actually false. The Sabbath was written by God, instituted after creation, before sin. As a matter of fact, before the writing of the Ten Commandments, Exodus 16, they were keeping Sabbath, okay? One of the reasons why Israel was taken out of Egypt was to keep the Sabbath, because slaves cannot have a Sabbath. And he was right. So slaves needed to be free. And that's why they were redeemed from the Egyptian bondage, so that they can keep the Sabbath holy. Significant. You cannot do away with this reality. So these are all things we can talk about. Again, I would like to say, final thought, and I'm done. It's just, when you look at the Sabbath, though, the fact that God put it in the Ten Commandments is very significant, because he wrote it with his finger, and whatever God writes, there's no mistake in it. There is no undoing. There is nothing you can nail to the cross, because God himself wrote it. That's not the same thing with the law of Moses. The second thing you also got to keep in mind, when you compare the Sabbath, you do something I would like to refer to that is known as typology. Okay, typology, right? Let's do some biblical typology. If you compare the Sabbath to, let's just say, the Garden of Eden, or the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? Think about it. God had a tree in the Garden of Eden called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And God had one restriction: you should not eat of it, neither shall you touch it, right? Lest you die. The same thing is true when it comes to the Sabbath. Out of all the trees that were in the garden, God set one apart for himself. Out of all the days of the week, God set the Sabbath apart for himself. And God says to Adam, do not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God says to humanity, do not forget, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And God also said to Adam, if you disobey, you will die. God also said in the book of Exodus 31, that disobedience to the Sabbath shall surely be put to death. Now you may ask, why is that in the Bible? Well, sin is punishable by death. If the Sabbath is one of the Ten Commandments, since the Sabbath is one of the Ten Commandments, let me rephrase that, well, it's still sinning to break it. So to say it doesn't matter, 1 John 3 verse 4, whosoever committeth sin transgresseth also the law, for sin is the transgression of the law, referring to the Ten Commandments. So when you break any one of God's Ten Commandments, you commit sin. James 4 verse 7, I think it is. James 4 verse 7 or 17. So to break one is to be guilty of all. To know that which is right and chooses not to do it, it is sin. So there is no way of escaping this reality. So breaking the Sabbath is a sin, just like every one of the other 9. But the difference is that, just like the tree in the knowledge of good and evil, there were many trees in the garden, but there was one tree that there was a restriction in place. Out of all the days of the week, there goes one day when the Sabbath is to be a test. So in essence, just like you had to Adam and Eve had to eat of the tree to violate the law, you got to wait on the 7th day on the week to violate that law, because you can't break the Sabbath on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. You got to wait till Sabbath comes to break it. And it's interesting because the very thing that God says not to break, not to violate, to remember, are the very things that Satan has said to forget about. Satan told Adam and Eve, you can eat and do whatever you want. Well, I should say Eve, but Eve repeated the same message to Adam. So Satan told Eve, just You can eat, man. God, you shall not surely die. God is lying. God is lying to you. You can do whatever you want. You can eat that tree. God is love. God understands. He understands. He knows your heart. It's true. That's kind of what he's saying. Like, he knows in the days that you eat of it, your eyes shall be open. You shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. Today, we're hearing the same message, right? People say, you can keep whatever day you want. God understands. God is love. You can keep whatever Sabbath you want. There is no condemnation. We are saved in Christ. Jesus is my Sabbath. I'm saved by grace. I'm not under the law, but under grace. You will hear stuff like that, which is flawed, which is wrong, which is dead wrong. But again, this is where we are. What I'm trying to say is the same temptation that you saw in the Garden of Eden is being repeated in the light of the Sabbath. The same way Adam and Eve committed sin, many Christians today are committing the sin of Sabbath breaking, and they're thinking God will change his mind. It's not going to happen. Now, if you don't know, you don't know. God does not condemn a man for what he doesn't know. But if you do know, we have no excuse. There is not enough grace from the heart of God to save a man. Listen to what I'm saying. To save a man who deliberately violates God's law. It's best you say, Lord, I'm struggling. It's best you say, Lord, help me. It's best you say, Lord, teach me. It's best you say, Lord, work with me. But don't ever say, I don't care. It's not my problem. It's none of my business. These are a bunch of Seventh-day Adventists who are preaching this. I'm not a Jew. When you say that, when a Christian says that, you are digging a hole for yourself. And it's very deadly. Why? No matter how loving God is, he will not pacify deliberate disobedience. A person can say, God is love all he wants, right? And he is a God of love. But the love of God does not mean you can violate his law knowingly. Actually, to do that, the Bible refers to it as iniquity, is to sin in light. Now, if you have questions about the Sabbath and you want to know more and you want to start keeping it, we can talk. We should share. And the reason this is significant for me is because I don't want a person to be lost because I didn't tell them. Now, if you lost because I bother you with this subject or I talk about it and it annoys you, well, that's just you. That's your problem. But you cannot say in a judgment, Pastor James, this channel didn't tell you the truth. Now, I don't know about the other preachers and the other pastors. I can speak for myself. You cannot say, I didn't share it with you in the judgment. But the choice ultimately is yours. I would love, pray, talk, debate, question, answer your questions, have the discussion all you want. But I will not stop believing the truth, and I will not stop preaching it to you because it's a matter of salvation. It is rooted in God's law. There's no changing it. Much more could be said about that, but I'll leave this video. I'll leave the rest for another time. And again, great video. Link in the description below. Go over there and support them because they're doing the work of the Lord. Now, I may not agree with everything Dannis Prager talks about, but a lot of what they speak about on that channel is good, decent, okay? Educational, enlightening. Anyway, have a good one. Bye.